Dusty shelves, they're whispering tales. Silent voices in the night prevail. Pages torn but stories intact. Each spine a world that's expertly packed. History's ghosts rise from every page. Woven yarns from a bygone age. Golden mysteries with secrets tight. Agatha's plots in the candlelight. Turn the page, let the words flow. Through Austen's eyes, see hearts aglow. Secondhand magic, new worlds to chart. In this bookish heart we start.
Hi, my name is Talia. Welcome to Talia Nerds Out. I am once again in a different location. I have with me my darker glasses in case all the lights cause an issue. I've got two ring lights. I can speak. I've got two ring lights set up, which ended up being actually warmer than I anticipated. So I'm not wearing the little house. It's not really a house jacket. It's actually a jacket that I wear in the house because I get cold all the time. But these lights are definitely warm enough. But yeah, our Christmas tree has been taken down, so that location no longer is quite as interesting location as previously. But this is location where for the past 10 years or so, my mom and I have recorded our videos for our YarnTube channel. So all the setup is from that, and I'm not sure why this cat is sideways. Okay, there we go. But yes, welcome to, well, what we, in our knitting, in our YarnTube, we call our woman cave, but this is just, it's rented space for booktube right now. Anyway, I have a couple of videos that I hope to record at this time simply because setting up for me, even though this is an easier setup than in the past since I started using my phone instead of the camera that I had been using, the fact of the matter is I probably have a limited amount of times that I feel comfortable using the ring lights over the course of a week. So I probably will want to get as many videos done as I possibly can. And I could well, and actually probably will, go right into switching to my darker glasses just so that way I can prevent any sort of migraines. Hopefully before they decide to come into being. There we go. Okay, there. That's better. So I have rose-tinted glasses. I am going to do several reviews because I am a bit overdue for some book reviews for 2024. And I guess that I will start with the physical ones. I am starting to print out the covers for my digital books that I read simply because I find that I completely forget about my digital books and then I forget to talk about them. But I will try to start in some sort of order, but it might not be in any specific order. The book that I want to do a review on for this video is the read-along, the book for the read-along that was run, is currently being run by Elder Talk and by Book Zealots, and that is David McCullough read-along, and that, I'm not sure if they're calling it read-along or readathon. Anyway, that is running, it was running over 2024, and I forget exactly when it started in 2024, and I don't have my little cheat sheet with me, but so whenever it started in 2024, and then it goes through some point in 2026. This was the second book that I read for 2024. The first one was the Johnstown flood, which I do have a review for. This one is the October-November read with a break that was meant for December, also meant for catch-up. I needed every bit of that break to catch up, because for me, this was a bit of a slow go at the start. And that is David McCullough's The Great Bridge. Like I mentioned at the start, it was a bit of a slow go for me, mostly because of the technical nature of the material. The personal aspect of the story is always going to be the most interesting aspect for me, especially since the whole reason I joined the David McCullough Readalong, Readathon, whatever, is because I was particularly interested in the biographies. John Adams, for example, and also the one on Truman. But I had heard so many good things about David McCullough that I was like, okay, well, let me just join in. Why not? And Johnstown Flood was another one that was a bit of one that I was like, not necessarily a topic I would have gone into really wanting to learn about, but I ended up getting a lot out of that book. And this was another case. This book was actually a bit of a heftier read, in my opinion, than the Johnstown Flood was. There was a lot more technical stuff when you're dealing with the actual construction of the bridge and the engineering and the planning that all went into that. And I don't have an engineer's mind, so that part of things was difficult for me. I had trouble picturing some things. Sometimes I would stop and kind of like be like, okay, what are they actually saying here? What does that look like? And there are pictures in the book, but not nearly as much as I would have perhaps liked for the concepts that were being discussed. But in spite of all that, once the story really started going, I thoroughly found myself enjoying it. For me, the point where I finally hit I got this. It was around halfway point, and from that point onward, it was just such a fast read. I went from being like halfway through to finishing the rest of the book in a couple of weeks, if that. So it really was, for whatever reason at that point, a switch was flipped in my brain. And I'm thinking it might have been around the point, actually the chapter might have even been the heroic mode. Maybe a little bit before that with the mysterious disorder, where you're talking about the beds. But once the story focused even more of its attention on Washington Roebling and the struggles he had to overcome, the politicking he had to contend with, the fact that once he became afflicted with the bends because of the work he put on the bridge, there seemed to be this campaign to throw every possible blame at him. And then when he was finally at the point where he could just about taste victory, they wanted to snatch that victory from him and hand the project off to someone else. I ended up caring deeply about Washington Roebling, and I would get quite incensed at some of the other figures that he had to interact with, usually by letter, because he was stuck to his sick room, to the house where he was, because of having been afflicted by the bends. And then the neurological after effects for him, which left him very fatigued by interaction or excitement, and also left him what sounded to me like he was being overstimulated easily. He described it as a nervous disorder. I think that his nervous system was a bit shot. And I mean nervous system as in actual nervous system, not like just being nervous. And that's not to having an anxiety issues is in and of itself its own issue. But I do believe there might have been a nervous system component to some of the symptoms Roebling was describing, just because of all the pressure that was put on his body from him going in and out of the caissons, what they didn't know about what the bends did to the body, and the fact that he kept pushing himself physically to really, while there might have been the fact that he sent himself maybe into something of a nervous breakdown, I think that it was a multifactorial issue. But it goes into really some of the things about how instrumental his wife Emily was. Really, she seemed to be like one in a million. She sounded like she was something of a firecracker. And she was a huge support, kept all the various personalities working together while not even, having an official position. But there were so many people who were convinced that Washington had become so, like he had become either demented or that he was basically a vegetable, that they would actually address their letters that should have been for him to her, thinking that she was the true mind behind everything, because they were so convinced, certain people were so convinced that he was really not, like he'd been so severely affected by the bends that he no longer really was the man he used to be mentally. Whereas that couldn't have been farther from the truth. He continued to be a brilliant mind. He continued to almost micromanage from behind the scenes. People would write and say it was amazing the tomes that he would, even if he couldn't physically write it, a lot of times, actually for a long time, Emily was doing the writing for him. But before the point where he couldn't write himself, he was doing it all himself until it just got too much for him, because of the fact that for a while he was losing his eyesight. He was having trouble holding a pen or whatever he happened to be writing with. I guess it could have been pencil. I know she would write in pencil before writing it again in pen. But he, before that point, before he had degenerated to that point, they mentioned that his writing was very precise, small, neat, and you would rarely see any sort of error in his writing. And these would be like detailed, very specific notes. You could follow directly the notes that he wrote, and basically you had a blueprint because it was that detailed up until the smallest detail. And people were talking about the fact that these things that he wrote out as he could feel his health going ended up being so important to the making the bridge a success. And he was involved in all aspects. Yes, he had his people who were his feet on the ground, but he wasn't, and to a certain extent, he had been on the ground far more than many engineers would have been. He learned that from his father. And even after he became sick, he was more involved even than other engineers of a certain level, a certain caliber would have been, because they they delegated to other people. He delegated as much as he was forced to, which is honestly part of why he ended up where he was with the severity of the bends that he got, and with and also with what was probably a component of a nervous breakdown. But I thought it was interesting that there were people who spent time in the caissons like he did. He spent every day who never got the bends, whereas other people who might spend only a few minutes or spend not necessarily a few minutes, but they would spend much less time and they would get the bends, maybe even die from it. One guy died on his first day. But I forget where it was in the book. They mentioned that later on they determined that, yeah, part of it is how healthy a person was going in and the amount of time spent in. Those all had, their parts that they added to who would and would not get the bends. But they also talked about the fact that, of course, how fast you came to normal pressure, when transitioning from the high pressure environment to the normal pressure environment. That had an effect. But the other thing they were talking about is like people who were more inclined to feel like the weather in their bones, in their joints, were more, it seemed almost like they were more likely to get the bends, which kind of makes sense to me to a certain extent because you're dealing with pressure, and what a lot of times people are feeling in their joints and stuff, that's the barometric pressure. So it kind of like makes sense in my brain that, people who are more sensitive to that pressure might be ultra sensitive to a much larger, more oppressive kind of pressure than is normal. And so that whole thing was interesting when they went into, they have a whole chapter where they're specifically really focused on the bends. But this is really a story of a man who, beats the, he went in with a tough job ahead of him. The very first, right going in, his first challenge to overcome was his father, who was the person who convinced people to buy into this project, who was the initial planner of the project. He dies right before anything gets started, other than let's, seal this deal and, the basic plan set. Then, next bearer, Washington, partway through ends up getting the bends and ends up having to spend the rest of the time in his sick room managing the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, which some of the stories in here are amazing. Some of the things about how they ended up putting up the wires between, and wires is, they were wires. They were twisted, like kind of braided wires that were made tight to make them strong, but they were still very thin. But when they would string the wires from one tower to another, and them talking about that whole process, and the guys that we got who are involved with that whole section of the book is so cool. And it really is, it's great reading when you get to that part. And hearing about all the different men who came up to attention and how people were watching from the shoreline, as it almost was like a carnival sometimes, watching these guys up on the wires, getting everything set up so you could actually have the suspension part of the suspension bridge. But that was really cool. But yeah, I was saying that this is a story about really a guy who had to overcome different odds. It just seemed to keep hitting him in the face. And it just seemed like every time he overcame one odd, another one. And the pressure kept rising and rising and rising until it seemed like at the last moment he was going to be robbed the satisfaction of having his golden moment of victory while he was in charge of the project. They wanted to rob him of that too. It's a really interesting story, and it also paved the way nicely for the next book, which is what we're currently reading, which is The Path Between the Seas, which is about the Panama Canal. And the way that even though it's a different time, it's like not exactly the same years or anything like that. It's, close in time, but not exactly. It's what's interesting about this is that in the book, one of the reasons that someone gives for why Roebling not being present is not a big deal. And they bring up the example of the fact that the Suez Canal was planned in Paris. Now, what's so interesting about that is it actually doesn't work for proving how Roebling was absolutely fully capable of what he was doing. Roebling was fully capable of what he was doing, but the de Lesseps, who did the Suez Canal and who also was the guy behind the Panama Canal, and I have very strong feelings about de Lesseps, which I will save for when I talk about that book, but he was not actually an engineer. He was a personality. He was a showman. He was an egoist who had the charisma to overcome any objections to get what he wanted. That was the man who pushed ahead the Suez Canal project, who really was the brain behind that. He didn't actually know what he was doing. So that's why it's so funny that that was the example they pulled out. And a lot of people did think he knew what he was doing, but he didn't. He just got lucky. And I think he had the right people working for him, and he lucked out with the environment of the Suez area versus what he later has to deal with the Panama. But I just thought it was funny that it leads into de Lesseps' story for the Panama Canal when you mention the Suez Canal in passing in this book. Now, Roebling was 10 times, 100 times, many more times the genius than de Lesseps was. Roebling knew what he was talking about, and he deserves all the credit that, he gets, or rather than a lot of times his father gets, because people a lot of times kind of like smushed him and his father's reputations together because they kind of forgot that there were two different Roeblings involved. But he deserves the credit of being an amazing engineer that de Lesseps ended up getting and didn't deserve. But yes, a very good book, and I accidentally let my disdain for de Lesseps come through in this review, but very much like Washington Roebling. While this is the story about the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, this is really the story of Washington Roebling. But the Brooklyn Bridge is, of course, the focus, but that is your hero of the story, is Washington Roebling. Thoroughly enjoyed this book. Highly recommend it. It does start off a bit slow, but it's well worth getting to a point later in the book where it just really heats up, and after a while, I just couldn't stop reading. What would I rate this? I think I ended up giving this a 4 stars, simply because it was a harder book for me to start going on. But if I was to just rate the last half of the book, I would give it 5. So that's it for this review. Hope that you either find yourself interested in reading this book, or if you have already read this book, how did you enjoy it? Did you find, like I did, that once you reach a certain point, it really started flowing and you couldn't put it down, or did it never really pick up for you? So yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for joining me. Hope that you have a wonderful day, and I will see you for the next video. God bless. Bye.